Cleopatra is one of the best-known characters in history and the most famous queen of ancient Egypt, even though she was part of a Greek dynasty, ruled a Hellenic kingdom, and was born and lived in its capital, Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great. It is also often forgotten that Cleopatra lived closer to the present than to the construction of the pyramids of Giza, and that her name is Greek and means glory of the Father. Some ancient representations of her head are preserved, from which it is believed that her nose was aquiline. Dion Cassius says that she was the most beautiful of women, had a charming voice, and knew how to treat anyone with pleasure. Plutarch, on the other hand, says that she did not stand out for her beauty, but for her personality and charisma, and emphasized above all her gift of languages, since she was the first Ptolemaic ruler who learned Egyptian, and in addition to her native Greek, she was able to speak with representatives of the Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Parthians. To all these languages must surely be added Latin. In the year 50 BC, Julius Caesar, in the midst of a civil war, arrives in Egypt in pursuit of his enemy Pompey. Another civil war is taking place there. Cleopatra had first been co-regent with her father, taking as her name Cleopatra VII, and the titles Thea and Philopator, goddess friend of her father. A year later, her father died and appointed her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old, as co-regent. However, Cleopatra was forced to flee by Ptolemy's supporters and took refuge in Syria to gather an army. As it was, Caesar met Ptolemy, who gave him the head of his enemy Pompey, whom Ptolemy's advisors had murdered in an attempt to curry favor with Caesar in his own civil war against Cleopatra. On the contrary, Caesar burst into tears at the sight of the head, calling him a fellow citizen and enumerating his deeds. He condemned his assassination and ordered the head to be prepared and properly buried. It is probable that Caesar pretended, or that he really thought it unworthy that a foreigner should assassinate Pompey, a Roman citizen, without proper legal safeguards. Cleopatra and Ptolemy's father had entrusted the Roman people to guard Egypt, so Caesar spent time in Egypt trying to get the two brothers to reconcile. Cleopatra was forbidden to enter the royal palace where Caesar was staying during his stay, but at some point there was a meeting with Cleopatra on the sly of Ptolemy, described thus by Plutarch. Cleopatra boarded a small boat and boarded the royal palace when darkness had fallen, got into a bundle of blankets as long as she was, and her friend Apollodorus, tying the bundle with a strap, introduced her into the presence of Caesar, who is said to have been smitten with Cleopatra, thanks to this, his first ruse, finding her brazen, and who afterwards, captivated by her conversation and grace, reconciled her to his brother in order that she might share the kingdom with him. Cleopatra was undoubtedly aware of Caesar's reputation as a lover, womanizer, and adulterer, who was called the man of all women and the woman of all men. Caesar reappointed both co-regents, and it is believed that he also had them marry each other, following the Ptolemaic tradition of marriages between brothers. At the same time, a romance was born between Caesar and Cleopatra. However, Ptolemy had not dismantled his army and tried to wipe out Caesar, who took notice and burned the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, unintentionally causing the burning of the Library of Alexandria, a great loss to mankind. Finally, Caesar defeated and killed Ptolemy in the so-called Battle of the Nile in 47. When Caesar left to continue his war, Cleopatra was already 7 months pregnant. The following year, on the occasion of the celebration of Caesar's triumph in the Civil War, Cleopatra traveled to Rome. She stayed in a house of the dictator, which was a great scandal, although she traveled with her new husband, her other brother, Ptolemy XIV. In her entourage was also the astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria, who would be instrumental in the Julian reform of the calendar. During her stay, the Temple of Venus Genetrix was built in Rome, where a statue of Isis was placed in the image of Cleopatra. After the assassination of Caesar, Cleopatra returned to Egypt, although she continued to claim the right to rule of the son she had had with Caesar, named Ptolemaic Caesar and nicknamed Caesarion. Shortly after Cleopatra's second brother died, poisoned by her according to some sources, and she appointed her son, who was already 3 years old, as co-regent. After a turbulent period for the Roman Republic, Octavian, Caesar's heir who would later become the first emperor and adopt the title of Augustus, and Mark Antony, Caesar's number 2 until his death, divided the Roman territories. Octavian took the western part and Antony the eastern. Antony and Cleopatra met in Cilicia in 41, and Antony fell in love with her as soon as he saw her. According to Plutarch, this is how Cleopatra arranged the meeting. She prepared many gifts, money, and all that pomp with which it is convenient to wrap oneself on great occasions, and which was proper to a prosperous kingdom like hers. Most of these ornaments, however, he carried with him, pinning his hopes on the magical fascination of his well-groomed personal charms. She set out to ply the river Cydno in a boat with a golden stern, on which purple sails were spread, and even the oars had bronze handles, while the harmonious melody of a concert of flute, caramillo, and zither enveloped the whole. She herself rested in the shade of a canopy embroidered in gold, adorned in the same way as Aphrodite in the paintings, while arranged on both sides some children, also dressed like those lovers of the paintings, gave her air. Likewise, the maidens of the most outstanding bearing of her retinue were dressed as nereids and graces, some handling the helm and others the capes, and suggestive aromas, exhaling rich perfumes, were poured along the shores. Everywhere, the word was spread that Aphrodite was going to Dionysus for the good of Asia. Josephus says that Antony became enslaved by love for Cleopatra. Plutarch adds that in addition to being in love, he was bewitched. They go so far as to accuse him of murdering Cleopatra's remaining siblings at her request. Like Caesar, Antony was married, which also moved the moralistic Roman society and made it easy for Octavian to attack him as his enmity with Antony grew. Antony's wife, Fulvia, died, neglected by him, in Greece, where she had fled with her children. Antony neglected the affairs of Rome and apparently ignored the attacks against him for falling into the hands of a barbarian queen. Together they had 3 children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony officially recognized them, which was the umpteenth scandal in Rome. He also promised to give them regions that had been assigned to him, and even some that were not even under Roman power. This he also wanted to make known in Rome, but the consuls did not agree to communicate it publicly. Octavian cleverly took advantage of Antony's eastern slackness and excesses, and, with all Roman public opinion against the couple, Octavian started the 4th and last Roman civil war in the 1st century BC. Plutarch tells us that Antony indulged in fun and lust in Alexandria, founding with Cleopatra a brotherhood called the Inimitable Lustful, who every day held banquets in honor of each other, being incredible and inordinate the amount of money they spent. The decisive defeat against Augustus in the naval Battle of Actium in 31 BC did not cause them any concern. On the contrary, having lost all hope and concern, they filled the city with banquets, drunkenness, and revelry. Then they dissolved that brotherhood of the inimitable vivadores and founded another, which they called the Brotherhood of Those Who Die Together. Meanwhile, Cleopatra accumulated all kinds of poisons, and to see which was the least painful, she tested them on prisoners condemned to death. She found that only the sting of the asp produced a sweet drowsiness and a kind of faintness, a death akin to falling asleep forever. One day, having formed his ground troops around the city, Mark Antony looked into the harbor and saw that his ships were passing over to the side of Augustus. So did his cavalry and infantry. Antony retired to his quarters. He heard that Cleopatra had committed suicide and threw himself on his sword, cutting open his belly. It was not a mortal wound, and on regaining consciousness, he learned that Cleopatra was alive and asked to be brought before her as he could not walk. Cleopatra had taken refuge in a tomb and did not open the door to Antony, but leaned out of the window and threw some robes for him to be taken up. She received Antony's body in tears as he bled to death. After the death of Mark Antony, Cleopatra was captured by Augustus, and being informed that she was being taken away from Egypt, she asked to celebrate Antony's funeral. She also gave a great banquet, always guarded by Augustus's guards to prevent her from committing suicide, as she was to be taken to Rome to be displayed as a trophy in the triumphal parade. After the meal, Cleopatra sent Augustus a note in which she asked to be buried next to Antony. When Augustus sent guards for Cleopatra, she was already lying dead in her bed. It is said that the asp was introduced at the banquet, hidden in a tray with figs. This is Plutarch's version. Other authors suggest other types of poisons. Octavian also ordered the assassination of Caesarion to avoid possible hereditary disputes. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selina did parade in chains at the triumphal parade of Augustus, together with an image of Cleopatra. With the death of Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, the region became a province of the Roman state that already dominated the entire Mediterranean and also ended the Hellenistic era, which had begun with Alexander the Great. That's it for today, but don't worry, we're just getting started. Thanks for joining this historical ride, and get ready for more fun facts and stories in the next video. See you soon, time travelers.